Hi class, Miss Stevens here again, and we're on to our second video. This one's more closely connected to our first unit of study, the Industrial Revolution. And before we can get to that, we really need to understand, well, what was pre-industrial society really like? That's going to allow us to understand the changes that were brought about during the Industrial Revolution. So to begin with, I've got quite a detailed image for you here of a medieval village. And if you have a close look at it, you can see that we have a manor house up the back. That is where the lord or the knight or whoever owned the land lived. And we can see that there's a church in the middle there, the Catholic Church being extremely important, influential in the medieval world. All around the village we can see fields that have been sown with crops or perhaps with animals grazing. And down the bottom you can see the people of the village working, and in this case they are harvesting wheat. Some of the sort of inventions that we've got here, we have a water wheel down the front. That was certainly not in every medieval village, but was in some. And we can see some of the small houses, sort of triangular in shape, and with their thatched roofs or their straw roofs. So the pre-industrial world was very, very slow paced. It was simple. And it was quite unchanging in comparison to our times today. The pre-industrial world was based on systems, practices and beliefs that had existed for many, many centuries. And in fact, we could take it right back to classical or ancient times. And if a Roman had visited a European village during the Middle Ages, they would have found it quite familiar. In Europe, almost everybody lived and worked in the country. From 1300 to 1750, for the average peasant, their life was within a very small confine. They worked a small plot of land, they grew crops, mostly for their own consumption. They milk cows or goats, they turn some of that milk into butter by churning it. They tend to farm animals like ducks and chickens. And they live a very small life, I suppose, compared to what we would be used to. So their life is focused on farming. And here is an illustration from a medieval manuscript showing different types of farming or rural activities. So generation after generation, families who lived in the country relied on tools that had changed very little over centuries. They had wooden ploughs, oftentimes owned by the lord, and they were dependent on beasts of burden to pull them, sometimes a single ox. Some families didn't have any beasts of burden. Transport, roads and modes of communication were quite basic. Most people, if they were to travel anywhere, would be travelling on foot. Those who were rich would be travelling on horseback. And communication was via letters, if you were perhaps a leader or in the church, or via verbal message. And as a result of this, most people never left the village that they were born into. They had very little understanding of what was going on in the wider world. Information they did receive about events, in other places or battles and so forth was very, very slow in coming. The Catholic Church dominated all the learning during the Middle Ages, and most people's lives were quite strictly controlled by their local priest and by religious practice. Most of the population had a very simple diet of whatever they could grow, which usually was what was called pottage, basically a vegetable soup. They very rarely had meat, although fish sometimes, if they lived near a lake or a river or by the seaside, was very important, as well as things like eggs. Unfortunately, if crops failed, then families starved. There was nowhere else to get food. They wore the clothes that they made themselves, and they owned goods that were produced locally. The population during the Middle Ages was very stable. If you have a look at this graph, although it shows many different places, you can see the dark blue line is for Western Europe. And if you look down to 1500, you can see that the line is fairly flat. So really, during the medieval period and the pre-industrial period, the world doesn't change very much in terms of the number of people living in it. the population density is very, very low. This is a result of poverty, war, plagues, poor hygiene, and a lack of food, which leads to really high death rates, especially among young people. So in the 1600s, we know that about 25% of all babies die before they turned 1. And then another 25% of those who survived would die before they turned 10. And so this means that population growth is very, very minimal. We also have issues around mortality for adults. For women, childbirth was extremely dangerous and could quite easily lead to the death of the mother. And for men, mostly it was war. But if we have a close look at that dark blue line, and you start having a look down between that 1700, 1800, and even in that 1600, you can start to see that it is in fact slowly going up. And the pre-industrial period is a time where we start to see just the beginnings of increase in population. And this is because there were a few innovations in the way to farm, and so we have slightly more food being produced. And this means that there's less people dying of starvation or malnutrition and diseases because they were underfed, which means that there's more people to work the land. And we start to get a few new ideas coming in about how to most effectively farm the land, which we'll be looking at in more detail later on. And so we end up getting this cycle of increasing population. And eventually, all these extra people who are surviving will form the basis of a very large and cheap labour force, which is going to be crucial for the Industrial Revolution to occur. Something else that characterises the pre-industrial society in terms of medicine is that it was quite limited. You know, most people in this period were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. They were highly superstitious, and they were also very much unaware of the importance of hygiene in preventing infection and disease. Their idea of healthcare was that physical suffering from an illness was actually God's divine way of either punishing them or purifying their soul. Of course, they were ignorant of microbiology and germs, although other societies at this time were starting to understand these things. In Europe, early modern physicians really relied on things like astrology, studying the stars, and bloodletting in order to cure people rather than science. And in this picture here, you can see that the person sitting down is holding out their arm, and the person standing up has something in their hand, and they are in fact bleeding that person. You can see the blood going down into a bowl. It was thought that if they got rid of the bad blood, which must contain the wrong kinds of gases, then the good blood would arrive and they would be able to get better. And in some cases, this is not completely a wrong idea, but certainly for people who may have already been undernourished, this was only going to make them weaker. We have doctors diagnosing people based on the colour of their urine. This was quite common. And they sometimes prescribed their treatments based on the idea about the colour corresponding to an imbalance in what they called the humours, or in other words, sort of gases that they believed were inside the body. We have here four people lined up who are covered in spots, and these people have the plague, and we have a priest over here who is blessing them and saying that God will cure them, which of course didn't happen. So what we have is the medieval and the pre-industrial world meant that life was very hard, it was dangerous, and it was often quite short. So most people are living lives characterised by lots of really hard physical labour, with very few effective treatments for injury or illness should it occur. Now, the economy was based on what was called the feudal system. So wealth in pre-industrial European society was concentrated in the hands of a very few number of people, and poverty, as I've just said, was quite common. Now, we can see here this triangle, and it shows the different classes of people that existed in medieval society. Obviously, at the top we have the king, and then underneath them we have the barons and bishops, or the lords, and are those people who are high up in the church. And then under them we have knights and priests, only a few thousand of them. And then underneath we have peasants. So in England we might have had something like 1 to 1.5 million peasant farmers. Now, this system was introduced by a person called William the Conqueror, and he took control of England in 1066. He was living in Normandy, which is in France, and claimed that he had a right to the throne of England. There was a lot of disagreement and eventually a big war, and he wins. He introduces this system from France into England, and it takes hold. So what we have is the majority of people being peasant farmers who barely earn enough to pay their taxes and then still have enough food left to survive. So they're paying taxes through their labour on the farmland, and they pay it in the form of crops, whether that be wheat or barley or any other kind of product. They give that to their under-tenants, and they then pass a portion of that up to their tenants-in-chief, which then gets passed up to the king. So everybody is passing up a service. Sometimes that service is physical labour on the land, and sometimes that service is in wartime. And if we look at the other side, what do they gain? Well, they gain access to land. Because when William the Conqueror comes to England, he takes control and becomes the owner of the kingdom. And he keeps some of the land for himself and then passes some of that land down to barons and bishops. They in turn keep some for themselves and pass some down to the knights and priests, who then allow peasants to farm small strips of land. So this system was based on birthright and land ownership. And unsurprisingly, the people at the top of this feudal system were the ones that had the most money and the most access to education. And as a result, it was these people who controlled decision making. The last thing that we're going to have a look at in relation to the pre-industrial society is industry. And the main form of industry in pre-industrial Europe was the cottage industry. So agriculture, farming, working in the country was the key way that people made money or made produce that they could swap with other people. So they have something called the cottage industry, and this is where agricultural families work at night after they've been working in the fields to spin or weave cloth with very basic machines like a spinning wheel, or they might be making woven baskets out of cane, those kinds of things. They might be making pottery, they might be making wooden carts. So they're farming during some time of the day or all of the day, and then at night time, or maybe their wives are going to be doing these things in their homes. And we have merchants that move about the countryside. They oftentimes provide the raw materials like wool or cotton to families. They pay these workers to finish the product, which might involve spinning it or weaving it into cloth. And then the merchants take those goods to markets in towns. They sell those products to people who live there and keep the profit of the sales. They then reinvest that money into buying more materials or trade goods and keep the cycle going. And this is because skilled craftspeople in towns and cities were paid a lot more. And so the cottage industry really allowed the merchants access to cheap labour, which was located in the countryside. And as a result of high levels of poverty, of course, rural families really wanted this opportunity to earn extra money. And it was also quite convenient because they're working out of their homes, and this allows them to get help from other members of the family or perhaps children. Oftentimes this cottage industry also relied on goods provided by the village, and they would sometimes then either swap or sell these goods to other people within the village. Now, at the transition into the industrial period, we get more and more people who are moving away from the countryside and they're moving into towns and cities. And so what we have is that these craftspeople who over time may have stopped farming and are only making items end up having to move themselves. They need to find a market to sell their goods or people who want to purchase their goods. And so what we see is a huge contribution to a large-scale movement of people within countries, not just outside of countries or internationally from one country to another.